My new CNC from ShopBot just arrived, so let's crack open the crate and get it assembled.
The machine I'll be building is a 4x8 PRSalpha with a vacuum table, automatic tool changer, and indexer. Everything short of the table sides and vacuum pump are shipped inside this crate. To start things off, I place the table sides together on the floor and mark the locations of the legs and cross supports. Next, I install the adjustable feet halfway into each of the table legs. I then separate the table sides and lay the legs out in their approximate locations. To secure the legs to the table sides, I slide T-nuts into the grooves on the table sides. Each legs require 8 T-nuts. An easy way to move these into position is by using an Allen wrench. To fasten the legs down, I use a bolt, something called a schnorr washer, and a flat washer combination. I now fine-tune the location of the T-nuts and loosely install all of the bolts. Using a speed square, I set the leg perpendicular to the table sides, and then I double check things with a framing square because apparently I'm a bit neurotic. Once the leg is square, I snug up all of the bolts in an alternating pattern similar to what you would do when you're changing a tire. With the legs installed on both table sides, it's time to secure the lower table supports. To do this, I loosely bolt the support to the inside of the front and back leg on one side using a bolt, lock washer, 2 flat washers, and a nut. There are a few steps while assembling the CNC where an extra person is very helpful. So I called in reinforcements and Kathleen came down to lend a hand while I secured the lower table supports on the opposite side of the machine. At this point, I now attach the middle lower table support. I then fling a few handfuls of T-nuts into the bottom groove of the table side and also secure the gussets, upper table supports, and cross supports with their respective hardware combinations. To help hold things in place, I use a couple of trigger clamps while running in the fasteners. And now for my next act. I will move the assembled frame to its final location all by myself with the help of a pallet jack. With the table in place, I moved on to getting the 800-pound vacuum pump into position. And the easiest way to move this around was again with the pallet jack, but I had to remove some of the lower supports and slide the cross support out of the way. Now I grab a chain and I get started removing the pump from the pallet it was shipped on. I go ahead and lift the pallet jack up and then I lower it down onto a couple of 4x4s so that I can get the pallet jack out of the way easily. Now that I have a bit more room, I can roll the engine hoist into position to lift the pump off of the pallet. Also, I fight the temptation to move around the pump with my foot and instead grab a 2x4 to help keep the pump parallel to the end of the CNC's bed while I lower it down. And just in case you're wondering why I'm using a 2x4 instead of my foot, it's because if that chain slips and the pump falls, well, you can pretty much say goodbye to my foot, and I don't want to do that. With the base right where I want the CNC to be and the pump in location, I now start dialing in the base using a level to make sure that the legs are all plumb. Kathleen again helps me to measure across the corners a few times until the base is square. After this, I tighten down all of the bolts. Next up, I run string across the corners to ensure that the sides are coplanar. Once all of the horizontal surfaces are level and the string is in place, I make sure that there isn't an excessive gap between the strings and that one string isn't deflecting the other. To correct any discrepancies, I raise or lower the leveling feet until the desired results are reached. Now it's time to attach the rails to the sides. To do this, I first set a rail on top of one side and mark each of the bolt hole locations on the CNC's side. I then slide T-nuts into place and I bolt the rail to the side using a straight edge to keep the rail flush with the CNC's side. And to secure the rail on the opposite side, I just repeat the process, but I don't tighten down all of the bolts completely. I leave them just a little bit loose right now. For me, this was the single most nerve-wracking step in the entire assembly process. I'm doing this by myself, and if it slips, well, that's going to be expensive. So again, I grabbed the engine hoist and I ran 2 heavy-duty straps through the gussets on each end of the gantry, so that way I had a balanced lifting point for the engine hoist. And this made the process really easy, and I was able to gently set the gantry onto the rails once everything was lined up. It went way smoother and faster than I thought it would. As a temporary precaution, I put some clamps on the end of the rails so that I wouldn't inadvertently roll the gantry off the rails. Next up, I installed the stop blocks and proximity targets into a rough position per the instructions. The proximity targets are actually on the wrong side here, so I switched those over to the other rail later on. Now it's time to get started installing the X-axis cable carrier. This keeps all of the cables and air hoses tidy and out of the way as the gantry moves along the rails. Once the brackets and trough are loosely bolted in their approximate locations, I open the first few gates on either end of the cable carrier and secure it to the bracket at the middle of the machine and to the gantry. Next, I run the gantry up and down the X-axis to make sure that the cable carrier will reach both ends of the X-axis. Now I unwrap all the tape that has the cables bundled up and I lay the cables into the carrier and close up all but the last few gates. I'll need to run a few additional cables and the air line through the carrier later, so I want to keep these first few gates open for now. To install the control box, I first attach the upper control box brackets to the side rail with these spring-loaded T-nuts that pivot into position along with a button head bolt. I then attach the lower bracket to the control box before lifting the box into position. To attach the control box, I angle it so that I can fasten the upper right corner first and then secure the other side and the lower control box bracket to the leg. Next, I work on mounting the VFD to the machine. Here I secure the upper bracket to the VFD and the lower bracket to the machine. Now I lift the VFD into position and set it on the lower bracket, and then I finish bolting it into place. To mount the spindle to the machine, I had Kathleen come back down to the shop and give me a hand. While I held the spindle in place, she ran the screws in to secure it to the YZ car. At this point, I'm ready to attach the X-axis motors. First thing that I need to do is install the pinions. To do this, I align the slot and the pinions with the key on the motor shaft. I then tighten down the set screw on the pinion and apply a little bit of grease. After double checking that I was putting the correct motor on the proper side of the machine, I loosely secure the motor to the gantry end plate. I then lift the motor up and roll the gantry forward and back just a little until the teeth on the pinion and rack mesh. I then tighten down all 4 screws while maintaining a bit of upward pressure. Next, I slide some heat shrink tubing over the connection, plug the motor in, and tuck the cables away. I'll come back later with a heat gun and shrink all of the heat shrink tubes on the machine once everything is up and running. The toolbar for the automatic changer comes pre-assembled in the crate, so all I need to do is slide in the T-nuts and run in the bolts. Once all of the bolts are loosely in place, I make sure that the distance to each end of the machine is equal and that the toolbar is level and plumb. Next up, I install the ATC manifold, which is what drives the pneumatic actuation so that the spindle can change tool holders. Once everything is in place, I reinstall the regulator for the pneumatic assist cylinder on the YZ car. On the control box side of the machine, I installed the pneumatic assist regulator. For this, I use some snap-in T-nuts and I bolt the assembly in place. Next up, I route the power cable and logic cables through the cable carrier along with the pneumatic hoses, and I make all the necessary connections. Now I grab the Z0 plate and a small U-channel bracket to mount them to the YZ plate with the pre-installed double-sided adhesive. After that, I just plug in the connectors and make sure the cables are tidy. For the base layer of the table, I used a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. The front edge is 2 3/4 from the front cross support and centered between the side rails. Once the base layer is in position, I clamped it in place with the bar on top so that I wouldn't potentially run into them while crawling around under the table. Under the machine, I marked the center of each hole in the cross members using a center punch, and then I drilled an 1/8 inch pilot hole. One of the clamps was covering up the last hole in this row. And do you remember how I had those clamps oriented?
Son of a nutcracker!
Well, let's just say that gravity was not on my side today. But before I go and check my face for damage, I've got a job to do. I might as well get that last hole drilled. After a quick check on my good looks and a minute to admire my new to-be scar, I grab a Forstner bit and twist bit to counterbore and drill for the carriage bolts that will secure the base layer to the cross supports. I use a dead blow hammer to drive the carriage bolts in and secure them with a washer, lock washer, and nut from the underside of the machine. And good news, no more clamps to the face. With all the bolts in place, it's now time to laminate the first layer of MDF to the Baltic birch base. The fastest way to do this is using a foam roller to evenly spread out a layer of glue on both surfaces. And luckily, Ryan from ShopBot arrived just in the middle of this, so he got to help me wrangle a gluey sheet of MDF, and Kathleen was so very happy at his timely arrival. With the sheet in place, we now grabbed all the 5-gallon buckets in the shop along with almost all of my clamps to clamp the sheet in place while the glue cured. While the glue cured, I got to work mounting the remaining pieces to route the dust collection hose, and then we fired up the machine for the first time, and I very timidly moved the gantry so that I could attach the dust shroud to the spindle. With all the mounting points in place, I run the hose up and over the spindle and secure it with the hose clamps and hose cradle. The dust foot easily locates on the dust shroud and is held in place with magnets. On the back of the gantry, I attached the other parts of the hose cradle kit, and I laid the dust collection hose in place. Once enough hose is in the cradle for the spindle to move across the Y-axis, I secure the hose with another hose cradle clamp on the far side of the gantry. The next day, we loaded up a spoil board cutter in the spindle and we surfaced the MDF layer. With the first layer of MDF surfaced, we then switched to a 1/2-inch end mill and cut 4 grids. Each of these grids has a hole in the center of them where they are plumbed to the vacuum pump, and this allows me to have multiple zones for holding down different sized materials. So I got wrapped up in the install of the vacuum plumbing and I completely forgot to record the process, but here are a couple shots of what everything looks like with it all in place. The instructions cover this process really well, and it is one of the few steps in the assembly process that having a second set of hands would be really helpful. Now that all the lines for the vacuum pump are run, we lay an additional sheet of MDF on top of the plenum layer, we fire up the vacuum pump to hold this sheet in place, and we surface the top side. This will allow for vacuum to be drawn more easily through the top layer. So next we close all of the zones on the pump and remove that MDF sheet. I then run a bead of glue around the perimeter and between each of the zones before laying the sheet of MDF back on the table with the previously surfaced side facing down. So with this top layer back on the table, we opened up all 4 zones to hold that sheet in place. Basically, we're just using the suction from the vacuum pump to clamp the top layer to the plenum layer. We then run the table surfacing program again, and this allows the vacuum pump to more easily pull vacuum through that top layer. This top layer is also referred to as a bleeder board. As the surfacing program was wrapping up, my daughter came down to check out the new addition to the shop, and I showed her how well the vacuum pump holds materials in place. Needless to say, we were both pretty impressed. So we've been on this whole assembly journey together, and I wanted to take a quick second and show y'all some of the projects that I've actually already made on the CNC. A couple topics that I'm going to be talking about in upcoming videos are specific vacuum fixturing to hold pieces on your machine. I'll also have an entire series on how I built this neck-through guitar, all on the CNC. So this was a unique challenge for me to learn how to automate the production of something I've made so much by hand. And I'm also going to be doing lots of cabinetry and furniture projects where I'm either making templates on the machine and then using them on the actual piece, or I'm cutting pieces on the machine for final assembly.
To watch my CNC related project videos, you can check out this list right here, and to see all of my other non-CNC related project videos, you can check those out. If you have any comments or questions, make sure to leave those below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And until next time, have fun making something.